On behalf of the UCLA Ellen D. Levy Center for Jewish Studies, I'd like to welcome you to the Michael and Irene Ross program in Yiddish Studies, highlighting Professor Saul Noam Zaritt today. Saul Zaritt is an associate professor of Yiddish literature in the departments of comparative literature and Near Eastern languages and civilizations at Harvard University. He studies modern Jewish writing and the politics of translation with a focus on Yiddish literature of the 20th century. He is a founding editor of Ingeweb, a journal of Yiddish studies. His recent work, Jewish American Writing and World Literature, Maybe to Millions, Maybe to Nobody, is available through Oxford University Press and wherever books are sold. And we will hear more about it in a minute. Today, we would like to thank you for staying socially distant and intellectually engaged by joining us for these virtual events. So, Saul, how did you come to write this book?
This is a book sort of based on my dissertation. And what happened was I thought I was going to write about something else, and I happened to end up writing a seminar paper that had to do with thinking about Isaac Bashevis Singer and world literature. He got a Nobel Prize after all, so that made him worldly. Mm-hmm. And I just started thinking about the world literature world, and there's a whole sort of theoretical set of trends around thinking about world literature that have become popular at the time, and I really wanted to figure out what it might mean to think about that conversation or think through that conversation through the idea of Jewish writing and Jewish American writing in particular, and especially those writing in Yiddish. So it just became a world or a kind of avenue through which to think about lots of different conversations at once that I felt at the time weren't taking place. So thinking about Yiddish, thinking about Jewishness in America, and thinking about the sort of global or worldly parameters of all of those things coming together. So that was, I guess, the motivation behind it. And one writer led to another, and thinking through them together and rewriting my thoughts about them. And then it sort of emerged into this book, I guess, over time. And do you want me to say a little bit more about the book and give us sort of a summary? Should I do that? Okay. I should also say thank you. I didn't get to say that yet, to the Center for Jewish Studies for inviting me to this, to present about my work. And thank you, of course, to Yasmin for reading the book and engaging with me. And also thanks to all of you who are virtually listening. I know time is precious these days. So as I was just saying, one of the things that I was thinking about as I was thinking about these conversations, these different terms in conversation with one another, was what it might mean, one, to write for the world, and what it might mean to say that that might be Jewish, or to think about writing for the world in a Jewish way, or to name that writing as Jewish. And I think in many ways, we're used to naming a piece of writing as Jewish and having certain assumptions come to the fore right away, like that a piece of Jewish literature would necessarily be written by a Jewish writer or someone we can identify as Jewish, and that this person has some biological connection to Jewishness or identifiable cultural connection to a Jewish community. We also then tend to assume that there would be something Jewish to the content of that text or that book, that there's something in the text that is particularly legible for those with a Jewish background or Jewish knowledge, a knowledge of Jewish textual traditions. And these assumptions often face inward, as it were, meaning these assumptions are about creating a certain in-group that can claim some kind of collective ownership over the text. As we say in Yiddish, von unsere, one of ours, right? This sort of naming and claiming. And one of the things that I wanted to do in this book, in interrogating and focusing on the idea of world literature, is to focus on a text, is to avoid or thinking about the text or the author's identity, that this limits our reading, that there's something very self-contained about that mode of reading. And more often than not, a modern literary text never remains within a single circumscribed community in that way, even if it's only read by a limited group of people. More often, a text moves in multiple directions, borrows from multiple literary traditions, imagines all different kinds of readers. Mm-hmm. The text, even if named Jewish, doesn't just speak to a Jewish reading public, even if they're the only ones that are actually reading it, meaning the text speaks to multiple publics, even if only a limited group might read it. And that way, the text also finds its way into the world in some way. And it's this tension, or what I call in the book a kind of undecidability, between these different horizons for Jewish text that is the subject of my book. To explain a little bit more what I mean, it's worth looking at a quote from Bashevis Singer that figures into the title of the book, which I'll put the quote up here. Now, this is a quote from 1978, not from 1978 when Bashevis Singer won the Nobel Prize, but from 1963. So just before he became really famous. It's his first interview in English, and he's asked what kind of audience he imagines for his work. And he says, in my case, writing and thinking about readers would really destroy the work, the writer completely. But happily, I never think about such things. When I sit down to write, I have a feeling that I'm talking maybe to millions, maybe to nobody. Now, this is some 30 years after his move from Poland to the US. It's 20 years after the destruction of Eastern European Jewish life, and decades into the vast linguistic assimilation of Ashkenazi Jews in the US. So Bashevis Singer is pretty justified in being wary of depending too much on Yiddish readers, a population in steep decline. But he also quickly shifts perspective, claiming he never thinks about such perilous things as whether he's being read or not. Instead, he makes this rather vague gesture to millions and to nobody. And I want to know what this might mean. Now, the nobody could initially reference that sense of despair and tragedy we associate with the Yiddish writer, toiling away for a lost culture. And also writing for nobody has a kind of romantic quality to it. Writing as that solitary genius for the art of it all also conveniently frees himself from actually having to meet any of the demands that a reader might actually have. And in this way, in writing for nobody, Bashevis takes full control over the literary act. Meanwhile, he also gets to write for the millions, which we could initially read as an acknowledgement of the significance of translation. In the 1960s, Bashevis was just starting to get more readers and finding success in English language publications. He could indeed imagine being a bestseller, expanding audiences among Jewish American readers, among just English language American readers, non-Jewish ones, all the world's readers. The millions promises that rise out of vernacular obscurity that's so tempting. This is the great promise of writing for the world, that ever expanding global circulation. Still, both of these possibilities, writing for nobody or writing for the millions, are couched with an all-important caveat, and that's this heavy maybe that haunts the text. Maybe to millions, maybe to nobody. Leaving his writing in a kind of limbo. Was it primarily for a Yiddish reading public spread thin across the diaspora of Yiddish speakers? Did he belong to a new category of Jewish American writers, immigrant and post-immigrant writers? Should his ambitions be larger to transcend such local and vernacular limitations through translation to some universal sense of literature, that universal code of world literature? One of the things that Bashevis seems to be saying here, kind of reluctantly or enigmatically, that he has no real answer to these questions. There's an uncertainty at the foundation of this work. And it is this uncertainty that's really the subject of my book. So I trace how Bashevis and other Jewish American writers like Sholem Asch, Glatstein, Kadia Molodowski, Saul Bellow, Grace Paley rely on Jewish vernacular culture in their writing while also placing themselves within the institutional boundaries of world literature. The result is a kind of writing that is in constant motion across and beyond the maps and networks of world literature, encountering both the demands of local audiences, so Jewish American readers, Yiddish readers, readers in English and in Yiddish, and the possibility of this enigmatic thing like the global market. And so my book explores that desire for the world, not just fame and global circulation, but this fantasy of legibility in which a threatened Yiddish or Jewish origin becomes the site for redemptive literary creativity. And in thinking about this desire, I also read those writers' inevitable failures to fully inhabit this fantasy. Instead finding what I call the ghosts of Jewish vernacularity that haunt their work and prevent or render full arrival in the world impossible or deferred. So the idea is to hold up the nobody and the millions, not as opposites to be synthesized in some way, but as the impossible conditions of Jewish modernity. And along the way, the different writers that are in the book take different paths. Some choose marginality, some reject marginality altogether. Some believe wholeheartedly in translation, others critique it relentlessly. They long for world literature as an institution ardently, while also still finding themselves elsewhere than they really wanted to be. And as I said before, one of the goals was to enter multiple scholarly conversations at once. I think, as I may have mentioned, the study of modern Jewish literature tends to be siloed in certain ways, assumed to be a world of its own by and for a Jewish population. But I think in pushing our thinking towards undecidability or multidirectionality, I want to encourage conversations that question this boundary making. So in what ways can we see Jewish vernacular cultures as entangled or even implicated within American imperial cultures? In what ways can we see translation, not as the discrete transfer between two different languages, but as constitutive of modern Jewish culture more broadly, including its implication within global networks? So when a poet like Yankov Glatstein writes a modernist poem in Yiddish, a poem no less innovative than, say, Eliot or Pound, what exactly happens, right? No one beyond a small Yiddish elite reads that poem, even today. What ways can we still imagine it as a translation of Anglo-American modernism, as a commentary on it, or as part of something that's called today global modernism? Or when Saul Bellow adamantly rejects the label Jewish writer, what happens? So how can we read Saul Bellow against a Jewish national claim on him without erasing those vernacular commitments that still shine through in his writing in some way, over and against his desires for universalization? Or is it worth naming Grace Paley a Jewish writer? Or would it be more productive to see her as a writer who leverages Jewish vernacular speech toward a radical politics of empathy? So I try to answer these questions through a methodology that cuts across the study of modern Jewish literatures, American cultural studies, and theories of world literature and globalization. And the aim is to produce a model that is comparative while also attentive to the conditions of Jewish vernacularity, the politics of translation, and the politics of difference. In this way, I hope to gesture with the book toward what I call, perhaps too often, a world literature to come, a space that defers institutionalization in favor of radical undecidability and creative solidarity. So those are the ambitious claims of the book, at least. And I look forward to more discussion as we move forward.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And as you have just said, world is such a central term both for you and for the writers you study. And you provide a really interesting distinction of different versions of world. To say a bit more in different languages, translated into different languages.
Yeah, world is it's a very sticky word. There's also I will stumble over word versus world over several times, probably in the next few sentences. World already etymologically in German, Welt, as a combination of various different languages, both Latin and vernacular, come together in this word. It also can mean both a physical space and a gesture towards existence itself. Mm-hmm. So it's both a measure of being in the world or being in a physical space, but also a measure of human existence in that space over time. And so it moves already. The term itself has history over time. And in Jewish vocabularies, that becomes even more complicated. So the most common word in Hebrew for world is olam. Now, it's a biblical word that doesn't actually mean world originally. It means something like eternity or the long durée of time. So most commonly, people will know the idea of olam hazeh and olam haba. So this world and the world to come. Or you say the most common blessing, you name God as king of the world, but also king of eternity, in the most common blessing that one says every day. So this sense of the world being bifurcated or having two conditions at once, both of the world, of a kind of very concrete material reality, and also always looking towards some kind of eternal or redemptive horizon for one's actions in and through the world. You are orienting yourself both in this world and towards the world to come. Of course, many different interpretations of what that mean within Jewish practice, so there's no dogma around it. But that's an amazing thing. But the amazing thing about Yiddish is that it contains both those worlds. So Yiddish is a language that is a Germanic language, but that includes Jewish vocabularies in it, and what we call Lashon Kodesh, which is Hebrew Aramaic, is incorporated within this what I would call a translational language. And so it has both Welt, the Germanic word, and Olam, pronounced in Ashkenazi Hebrew as Olam. And Olam doesn't just mean eternity or world, it also means audience. So sort of like the French tout le monde, like everybody, the whole world is that which is in front of you. So the Olam means, whoever's there in front of you, whoever's listening to you speak is the Olam. So this is a great corrective on these horizons of meaning, of which the world is both, a network, a material network of actors and markets. The world is also a universal horizon of some kind of eternal achievement, but also the world is this very concrete set of people reading a text or listening to a performance, experiencing a text in a particular way right in front of you. So there's a kind of, I like the way that these three modes of worldedness conflict with one another, but also inform one another in really powerful ways. One is always thinking about the material conditions that produce one's work, but also thinking about what the longevity of one's work might be, where it might find a different kind of home, what its kind of transcendent possibilities might be, but also that the limits on that transcendence are clear and constitutive of the work itself. Yeah, so that's the sort of translational meditation, one of the translational meditations I do in the book, in trying to think about these multiple vocabularies, Jewish and non-Jewish at once.
Could you say a bit more how then this should change our notions of world literature as a discipline and field? What can this Yiddish multiplicity of thinking about world and these writers, what can they help us to see differently about world literature?
This is not an easy question because the field of world literature is so enormous. So I don't want to speak for everyone that's written everything. I don't think I have everything read and categorized in some way, but I would say there's a tendency in world literature theory to think, I think, in two different directions. One is a kind of expansive, I would say, anthological mode of thinking, in which we're always trying to figure out who are the people, how can we think about all the world's literatures in I think, an expansive and generous way as possible. And that also is about thinking about literature itself as its own empire, often in sometimes utopian ways, as that which can resist other forms of globalization or can think about globalization otherwise through its own networks, its own logics of cultural transfer. And on the other hand, a largely post-colonial critique of this mode of thinking that wants to try to at least think otherwise, or push against these types of systematizations, or thinking that the anthology is itself a kind of form of a colonial mode of thinking, or has roots within an Orientalist mode of reading. And it often creates a kind of binary. It reproduces in that way an East-West formulation, or a major-minor, in which the minor becomes heroic in both cases, as the hero that needs to be saved, or is at the avant-garde or on the front lines of changing and revivifying literature especially as a contemporary force, contemporary cultural force. And one of the things I think is important in thinking about, one, the category of Jewishness, or the category of the Jew, and two, in thinking about Jewish writing, is that it allows us, or encourages us to think about both of those. It encourages us to think otherwise than the binary, or to think otherwise than the heroic mode, that I think can be very dangerous for these modes of analysis. In other words, Jewishness is both within Europe, or of Europe. It is part of how Christianity imagines itself. It needs Jewishness in a very particular way. And that's an enormous conversation that I won't open up too much now, but also does not make sense within Europe. I'm speaking typologically and stereotypically, so that Jewish writing in its emulation and longing for Europe, or a sense that it belongs in Europe, is always encountering this kind of limit, or what I would say a kind of translational boundary that it's always going up against, and that Jewishness seems to make sense within these hierarchies, within these universal libraries of literature, while at the same time containing within its own vernacular structures, its own vernacular histories that bump up against these structures. And so you have writers, at least many of the ones that I've been talking about in the book, that feel like they can find a home within American literature, within a national literature, within a European conception of world literature, and want it, and find themselves unable to actually bring it to full fruition in their attempt to retain or return to their own vernacular commitments, I would say. So that's why I think Jewishness as a category, alongside, of course, different forms of post-colonial critique and other forms of subaltern or vernacular writing, allows us to think and open up that binary or push against that binary in very powerful and I think productive ways. In that thinking about implication and writing otherwise at the same time, I think is more productive than this kind of oppositional thinking.
Yeah. You mentioned that when you were discussing world, the different meanings or the different words available in Yiddish for world, which brings me to the issue of multilingualism. In some ways, Yiddish itself is a multilingually formed, or more explicitly multilingually formed, a language in other languages. Yet in your discussion, you have these very interesting uses of monolingualism and multilingualism, where the authors, you describe some authors that write exclusively in Yiddish as multilingual in orientation, while others who are very much invested in translating in multiple languages and write in some ways for translation, in your reading turn out to be rather monolingually oriented. Could you say a bit more, maybe with some examples, about this counterintuitive use of monolingual and multilingual?
Yeah, so when I started this project, and those who read the book, they'll know that my sympathies are very deeply with the modernist Yiddish poet Yankov Glatstein and his attempts to defer world literature. He doesn't want to be translated. He holds on to this kind of what he calls ghetto leben, this sort of Jewishness that comes out of a writing that comes out of a deep embeddedness in Jewishness. He even makes this article in the 1930s in which he argues against the common turn in favor of the Yidden turn, against the Communist International in favor of this sort of devoting oneself entirely to one's rootedness. So that's where the sympathies lie. And so when I was starting the project, those are the people I wanted to write about. And then one of my advisors, David Ruski, said to me, well, you have to write about Sholem Asch. Now, Sholem Asch, a bestseller in English and other languages, very easily obtainable, his works online nowadays. Or back in the day, you could go into any used bookstore, his books would always be there because everyone had them and no one wants them anymore. So he's out of print, but his books are extraordinarily attainable and for cheap in their various English translations. And when I wrote the first version of the chapter on Sholem Asch, and I gave it to my advisor, and he said to me, "What you have to this is a little bit too harsh on Asch. What is he? Try to think a little bit more about what he's doing." And he became, for me, I think, a really important figure in trying to think about what it means to write for the world. He was someone in the 1930s who just assumed he was going to get the Nobel Prize. And he was extraordinarily disappointed that he didn't. He had that kind of personality. He was the celebrity. When we thought of who's the most famous Jewish writer in the interwar period, Sholem Asch was the guy. And he thought that this celebrity, I mean, he was a megalomaniac and he had a short temper and he was all of those things that we associate sometimes with the divas of celebrity. He had a beautiful villa in Nice. He was that kind of big personality, but also one who was tireless in his devotion for the Jewish people in some sense, at least is how he would describe it, and saw himself as an ambassador in that sense. And he saw translation or communicating his very almost ecumenical vision for a shared Jewish Christian civilization. He saw that as the great peace work that he needed to do to save the world and also to save the Jewish people. And this kind of, in some sense, hubris, but also this modeling of the kind of what worldly action or what literature could do on the world stage was the model that could not be replicated, I think, by any other Yiddish writer, but it was the model for that kind of, born in a shtetl of a kind of small world, of a very specific, almost ethnographic kind of writing, melodramatic kind of writing, easily translated kind of writing, but also one that could make it on the world stage. And that led to a large number of controversies. So one that I'm thinking of right now is that his novels were translated into German, and then from the German into English. And on the front pieces, on the title pages of the translations, the word Yiddish would never appear. It would say translated by XYZ, but in the English ones, those first ones were translated by the Moore couple, so the same translators of Kafka, who did not know any Yiddish, so the translations were a little bit strange. And the fellow Yiddish writers were up in arms. How could there be no mention of Yiddish? No one would know that this is a Yiddish novel. How can you not advocate for Yiddish? And Sholem Asch would respond, everyone knows that I'm the representative of Yiddish. It's in my name. My name hasn't been translated, right? I didn't let them call me S. Asch. It says there Sholem Asch, so it's sort of like a pronouncement of my Yiddish. I embody Yiddishness in some way. And this I see as a kind of monolingual paradigm in the sense that he saw himself as eminently translatable, as a figure who could transcend linguistic boundaries, regardless of whether the translation was good or not. Like, it didn't bother him that it was from the German. It bothered him for one of the novels that there were too many mistakes and he fixed them for the second edition. But for the most part, he thought, my ideas are translatable and they should be translated. And that the thing I write in Yiddish is precisely the same as that which comes out in another language. It's simply, I want them to exist on the same plane. In fact, he would argue that Jewishness is at the heart of Western civilization, and so doesn't need a very large sense of a large apparatus for translation since it's already there. His favorite biblical text, or one that he would promote, especially in the 1930s, was the Psalms, which he saw as the most translatable text, a shared text by both Christian and Jewish leaders of the world. So that's what I mean by kind of a monolingualism, an idea I adapted a little bit in some ways from your own books. I'm thankful for it. But this idea that not only is it associated with a kind of European nationalism and ideas of the European family, but that one could promote one's own language as part of that family, and thereby, even in its difference, it becomes part of a single coherent and identifiable system. So a very identifiable node, a Yiddish node within the European family.
Yeah, and your mention of Europe takes me to the fact that your book has been published in a very prestigious series, the Oxford series in American literary history. And of course, the writers that you discuss spend different parts of their lives in the US, and some more, some less part of their lives.
Yeah, none of them are US born. Saul Bellow was born in Canada, so he doesn't make it into US. Yeah. So
could you say a bit more how this additional framework, in addition to Jewishness, world literature, American literature as a horizon, how that functions for you, and what your book brings to that?
Yeah. Well, first, I'm very grateful, I should say, to Gordon Huttner, who the editor of that series and the editor of the journal American Literary History, who found and accepted my book and its ideas and promoted them and edited in a very generous and brilliant way. So I mean, the mistakes in the book are mine, but it is much better for his editorial oversight. But Yeah, there's a problem. It was an issue that came out in the journal Studies in American Jewish Literature that maybe the English departments have a Jewish problem.
Mm.
Or there's a sort of institutional history of ethnic studies within American studies or within English departments in the U.S. that is very complicated. And I refer here to books by Dean Franco and most recently by Benjamin Schreier, articles and a book, his latest book, that talk about a gap that emerged, especially in the post-war period, between the development of Jewish American literary studies, or of Jewish studies in general in the US, and its siloing within its own kind of worlds, and the development starting in the 1960s and 70s of ethnic studies departments in the US that were largely surrounding African American studies, Latinx studies, Asian American literature, and the like, and the sense that there wasn't exactly an alliance or an ability to understand one another, or even a desire to communicate with each other, both methodologically and theoretically, and also in terms of their institutional alignments. Jewish studies as a thing in the U.S. Academy happens in the post-war period. It's privately funded for the most part, and has a particular kind of institutional salience that didn't need to be argued for in the way that ethnic studies had to violently, in some ways, seize its own location within the university. So they never had that kind of alliance or shared politics, at least not very commonly. Mm-hmm. And also Jewish American writers as those big representatives of American literature more broadly, your Saul Bellow, Philip Roth, Bernard Malamud triumvirate, were already hailed as the great heroes, right? Saul Bellow wrote the great American novel with Augie March, The Adventures of Augie March. And that kind of institutional legibility and canonization was never a given for ethnic studies. So there continued to be, through even to the present day, a kind of gap between these modes of study and a set of apologetics, meaning you should be reading Saul Bellow if you want to understand the immigrant experience in the US. Why don't you read this character, this writer, or this sense of white Jewish privilege as preventing a kind of real dialogue between these different disciplines or different fields. So I'm hoping, my book, along with several others that have come out, not the only one, but this attempt to try to bridge some of those gaps, not through an apologetics, not through like, this is what we do and this is what you do, and let's see how we can talk, but to really just think in a robustly and I think aggressively comparative way, without giving up on difference. To not say, right, Jews are the model minority, the model immigrant, and you're copying us, quote unquote, but to think about the different ways that Jewishness and race and ethnicity work, as opposed to how it might work for Asian American, African American, and Latinx writers and communities. So that difference needs to be maintained because it's important to understand both the privilege, I talked about implication within larger networks, but to also understand how Jewish difference works in a very different way in America than it would for other ethnic, religious, cultural groups, right? America is founded as the city on the hill, ideas of manifest destiny. This is in Amy Kaplan's recent book about our American Israel, right? Israel, or the idea of Israel or Jewishness, figures so prominently into ideas of manifest destiny and Christian ideas of America that necessarily Jewishness must have a different function within American culture than many of these other ethnic communities would.
I think that's one of the things that I found particularly fascinating about your work, that you really are able to bring in all these very different bodies of scholarship and institutional context and frames of reference in these extremely nuanced ways. So that's been a real pleasure to read your book in that light. You mentioned difference, so I wanted to go on to one more type of difference that is quite striking and that you directly address, which is the issue of gender. So the main authors you discuss are all male Jewish American writers who are striving in either towards or away from, but in relationship to world literature, to somehow situate themselves in relationship to it. versus Jewish American female writers like Grace Paley, who you say have a very different kind of relationship. And I wanted to invite you to speak a bit more about this striking gender dimension.
Yeah. So one of the things I think I mentioned early on is that the book is a lot about a desire for world literature and this desire for representation in some way, or to be an ambassador for Jewishness, or to seize a kind of authority or mastery over Yiddish or over Jewish vernacularity on a world stage. And that, for me, that's a very masculinist stance, necessarily. It's about claiming ownership. It's about also claiming ownership over language. So logos, the fallow logocentric mode, to use, our Lacanian vocabulary. And that has meant that, especially critically, or the way criticism has analyzed or presented Jewish American literature, has always seen these male characters as the representatives, whether or not they wanted to be. They're adopted in that way. So for me to think about who are the writers that reflect on their Jewish worldliness within an American context, overwhelmingly is going to be those male characters, which means I'm getting a very partial understanding of what Jewish American writing might be and its connection to world literature. But because I was writing in a critical mode and writing with these writers and try to write against themselves or try to see where they don't understand, where they meet their own limits, I wanted to see how these men who were labeled in one way can be unlabeled or disenlabeled in some way, to use a neologism. And when I was rereading the book, or rewriting the book, or rewriting the dissertation, and part of that whole process, I started thinking about what would it mean to start thinking about this otherwise? So, meaning following in some sense the Glatstein model, this kind of mode of refusal or deferral of institutionalization. What would that look like if we also excise the kind of masculinism, or for Glatstein, it's clearly a sense of chauvinism, right? I'm in the ghetto and I want to be in the ghetto. What would it mean to kind of also try to shed that kind of ghetto mentality that comes with a kind of masculine stance against the tide of modernity, or rescuing this or that thing in the heroic mode? And I think for me, Grace Paley was certainly the way I wanted to end the book, as a gesture towards some other model. One, because she's such in our line of work, I should say, we don't always get to enjoy the reading that we have to do. And for writing this book and doing the research on it, these men are, for the most part, pretty terrible or grumpy. They're misogynists, they're egomaniacal. There's a lot that was not fun in some ways about reading a lot of their work. But Grace Paley, at least for me, returning to her work all the time, there's a kind of it's full of critical insight and it's not easy, but there's a kind of invitation towards other modes of thinking that is so generous, I would say, and generous in the ways that I think are really productive for thinking about this comparative mode that I've already been gesturing towards. Meaning, one, she doesn't care about prestige. I mean, she had her own ego, but she also, she wasn't going to write a big novel. She didn't care about the great American novel. She wanted to capture those vernacular moments of intimacy in her life and in the fictional worlds that she was creating and gesturing towards, but also to see those moments of intimacy, a conversation at a kitchen table, like a moment with one of her great aunts, to see those as moments that already spoke to, one, beyond the Jewish sphere, and two, towards global protest. There was no difference between her writing and her anti-nuclear war activism, which was a huge part of her life. Those things, they were overlapped and they were part of the same kind of practice. And I don't want to call this essentially feminine in some way or woman's writing, because I think those labels don't do much work, but I do see them as, say, non-foundational, or trying to think otherwise, and that her gender performance as a woman who's writing is an important part of that kind of deferral or trying to think otherwise about writing and about what it means to use or deploy a Jewish vernacular towards those larger horizons of meaning.
I think this would be a wonderful place to thank you for your book and for your discussion. So thank you, Saul, for discussing with us your wonderful book, Jewish American Writing and World Literature. And I hope that rather than nobody, it will find maybe not millions, but many, many, many writers who will be gratified by reading it. Thank you.
Thanks so much.